How do you feel about the media coverage of the war in Ukraine? Some journalists have been accused of showing white privilege and racism over their handling of the human interest stories emerging from the ruins and the rubble. Are white Europeans racist? And if so, where does it stem from? Listen to this French politician and you might get an idea. A Ukraine special of In Conversation with Yvonne Ridley follows, which I hope will answer the question about racism in the media.
Les Ukrainiens sont un peuple européen, chrétien, et qui donc est beaucoup plus proche de notre peuple français que les vagues migratoires des pays arabo-musulmans ou moyen-orientaux. Je le sais très bien. Donc je sais très bien qu'ils poseraient moins de problèmes en termes d'assimilation, d'acculturation, etc. Je le sais. C'est qu'il y ait un tsunami fondé sur l'émotion comme il y a eu pour le petit Elan. Et on a eu 1 million, voire plus d'immigrés syriens qui étaient en plus avec d'innombrables Algériens, Marocains, Africains qui se...
Mais ça veut dire quoi ça? Ça veut dire en fait, il y a carrément franco, hein. Il y a une immigration blanche chrétienne, vous dites ok, une immigration arabe musulmane, vous dites non.
Absolument.
Clairement.
Clairement. Aujourd'hui, tout le monde l'a compris que l'immigration arabo-musulmane est trop éloignée de nous et c'est de plus en plus difficile de les acculturer et de les assimiler. Donc effectivement, nous sommes plus proches des Européens chrétiens.
Yeah, they are Europeans. They are like us. We ought to feel outraged. These are, it's called like us versus them. This is the whole narrative.
Ibrahim Bahari from Uganda is a senior research fellow in Cape Town. One of his specialities is conflict and the colonization of African history, and exposing cases of white supremacy and how that affects people of all colour. Today, we discuss the coverage given to Ukraine and how the victims of war are vividly described by some media outlets as being white-skinned, blonde, blue-eyed people, just like us, as though the bodies of brown-skinned children pulled out of the rubble in Afghanistan, Syria, Palestine, Somalia, Yemen, Kashmir, and other conflict zones are worth so much less. To most people, the Russian media has been pro-Russia, as you would expect, and Western media has been pro-Ukraine. But you've spotted something, and I'm ashamed to say I didn't, but you did, spot an element of white supremacy bleeding through the Western media coverage on Ukraine. If you can explain that.
Yeah, I mean, the way the reportings came, it was so shocking. To most people, though, it was not a little bit shocking to me because there is always the savage, what Michel Trier calls the savage slot of why you have to create the savage so that you can go ahead and annihilate it. And the sentiment or the sensation that, of course, there is war in Ukraine. We have to be outraged. We have to be able to support Ukraine's self-determination as an independent state. But when you have to compare the attention which we gave to Ukraine self-determination, when we are comparing it to other African or Middle Eastern countries, that, we have to be able to be mad because, this is not a third world country. These are Europeans, they are like us. They have blue eyes, blonde hair. This is what actually was in that, and says, these are not from war-torn countries, These are people with Netflix and Instagram accounts. See this building, it's modern like what, all that is what was predicted into the media. I created a thread, definitely. I just pinned it on my Twitter. And yeah, I can read some of that to you if you want.
If you can, because that thread on your Twitter account was shocking, as well as quite illuminating as to the heart of this problem.
So yeah, let me start with this. It's wholly in there. So for instance, you have on the Telegraph, and this was, I think, this one says, "They seem like us. That is what makes it that is what makes it so shocking. War is no longer something visited upon impoverished and remote population. It can happen to anyone." And then it says, Vladimir Putin's monstrous invasion is an attack on civilization itself. So we're talking from the standpoint of when it's civilization, it is the West, you know.
So the attack on Iraq wasn't an attack on civilization, although Iraq was the cradle of civilization. Yeah, that is what it is. And then on BBC, this was with the Lozakins, and this one, he was interviewing someone who is from Ukraine, and he says, "It's very emotional for me to see. These are European people with blonde hair, blue eyes, children being killed." But you can imagine they have been killed. It has happened in Somalia. The US is bombing Somalia right now, but children have been killed. We know the situation in Somalia was created by the US when it outed the traditional leader, and there has been bombing ever since. And of course, children in Somalia have brown skins. The children in the rubble of Syria and Palestine and Kashmir have olive-colored skins. So the media is saying these are white children with blue eyes and blonde hair. They're actually—
And blonde hair. They're Europeans. They are like us. We ought to feel outraged. These are, you know, it's called like us versus them. This is the whole narrative. And this was also on BMF TV, which is a French TV, is that we are not talking here about Syrians fleeing the bombing of the Syrian regime backed by Putin. We are talking about Europeans living in cars that look like ours to save their lives.
Yeah, I mean, I really despair. What is the answer? I mean, there was a forum on Twitter last night to discuss this, and I was amazed that more than 450 people rocked up to listen to people like yourself talk about this this white supremacist style coverage. What is the solution?
I think the solution is, for me, what I was giving as key points to this, that we need to historicize and contextualize events as they happen. This is not a war that is just happening right now. It is partly ideological. Of course, within the US, we tend to see that this is not, it's the US still after 1991 still sees or has never forgotten about Russia being communist and it's something other that it formed into, you know. So when we just come here and we say, oh, this is just like, you know, what is happening, we have to support this, and we do not go back to history to be able to see what produced this. To be able to see, like, it was in Ukraine, rather in Crimea in 2014, and in Georgia as well. And those are the things that we thought they were just going to happen there. It was linking thing that this is just going to be another world war, the invasions there. So these are events which have been leading to this. So when we place things in a historical and contextualized historical context, then we get to be able to understand the ideology, first of all, of what is the ideology behind that. then we'll be able to understand what is the narrative, what is the context. Then the other thing which I think can be a solution is to pay attention to language. How we use language really, really matters. When you say, oh, this is civilized, what do you mean? When you say, oh, these are blue eyes, blonde hair, what do you mean? You know, what message are you putting across? You know, so words have power. Words communicate. We communicate through words. This is how we know. It's language is also part of words, and so we ought to be able to. And it's the news organizations need to really rethink about this, the context, or be able to call it out. And this is when you also know that news medias are white supremacist institutions, which are also, in a way, filled with patriarchy. And these are white men who are leading these narratives because they don't want to confront history. They don't want to confront anything. They're just so biased and they don't want to get out. And maybe the last one would be able that we need to have a sense of allyship, but also community sensitive building that in a way tries to engage people and educate them. You know, in this age of social media right now, people not only engage in clickbait information, which is also part of mis or disinformation, but also their feelings, they are tapping into their feelings to just be able to sell a particular agenda. And before we know it, this could be a genocide. For instance, I am seeing people saying, oh, we need to gas the Russians, the normal Russians. We need to be able to starve them, as if we do not understand their daily lived experiences of living under Putin, for instance. It's the common person at the end of the day, whether it's in Ukraine or in Russia, that is just going to be able to suffer. So I think we need to have a sensitive media that is on informing,
but how
historicizing, and
that change as long as the mainstream media is stuffed with pale white men in suits, which, you know, I've worked in the mainstream media, and, you know, how do you bring in that sort of change in the use of language?
Yeah, so the one what we can just do about that is, and there is one particular case of where there have been alternatives to this kind of mainstream media, of where we are actually promoting community journalism, solution-oriented journalism, of where we're having also Black and Brown communities coming up. Mid Press, I think, is one of those. Also other news organizations also coming up, whether it's on our Twitter spaces, whether it's on Instagram, whatever we are, trying to be able to create spaces of where we can actually retell the truth, because I believe this has been brought to so much attention because of so much of Twitter, though a lot goes on there, you know. So that is just one alternative of like organizing within ourselves to just be able to tell our stories, because that is very instrumental. But on the other side, I think news or media organizations have to go back and reflect, like hire Black and Brown people, you know, when you are talking about these issues, include them, you know, when you are talking about issues about women, include women, you know, and make sure that when you are including a certain person who is from the oppressed group or the minority, do not bring someone to be able to gaslight them. You cannot be able to bring someone who is, let's say, a woman talking about patriarchy and their daily experience in society. At the same time, you have someone who is a misogynist, sexist, racist, abusive man in the same space. So they are going to spend the next, like how many, half hour explaining themselves on why people need to see their valid point. So this confrontational journalism, this blatant journalism is not really effective. So if you can be able to center people's voices at the end of the day, I think that could really be helpful, because we come from a humanistic perspective also from an understanding perspective, humans have feelings. So if we can be able to give people a fair share of what is really, really on the ground and historicize it, contextualize it, I think they'll be able to do a great job. Yeah.
Well, diversity is obviously a starting place in newsrooms, and it would be interesting for any journalists from the mainstream media listening to this just to look around their newsrooms and, you know, how many women are working there, how many people of colour, how many people of different faiths or none. It's it sounds simple enough when you say it, but for anyone who's in any doubt, I would urge you to go on to Ibrahim's Twitter account, and I hope you're going to keep that tweet pinned up for a while yet, Ibrahim, because once you put it all together, you can see what a toxic combination it really is. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today to explain this, and hopefully, and I include myself in this, we'll all up our game and try and reflect the world that we live in. Now, moving from Cape Town, we travel over to Dublin, where journalist Jason Michael is based. And he gives us his view on the media coverage in Ukraine. He is the author of the Random Public Journal website and has a postgraduate degree in race, ethnicity and conflict from the University of Dublin.
Be natural in any geopolitical context for Russia to look after its own interests. And most certainly, we have multiple layers and multiple dimensions to the racism that we see certainly in the Western coverage of this. Primarily, I would see, first of all, the intense focus that we have on the refugee crisis. Now, first of all, as everyone is doing and as everyone should do, we have to applaud the efforts to look after refugees. These are the most vulnerable people in the most awful situation. We're looking at a situation where even Viktor Orban, the president of Hungary, who is not known for his great welcome to, as he describes them, migrants entering his country, has opened his doors wide open. And yes, we have to applaud that. We have to applaud the efforts being made even here in Ireland, with ordinary citizens being asked to open their homes. But there is this horrible elephant in the room with the reality of last year alone, 1,600 is estimated drowned or were lost in the Mediterranean. So many years from 2014, it's estimated by the UN High Commission that somewhere in the region of 25 to 26,000 human beings have died in the Mediterranean, plus those who have been kidnapped or gone missing, subject to, being preyed upon by human traffickers, by sex traffickers. And yet we don't know this. And it's not so much that we don't know, it has been offered to us, but it's not given this great focus. And sadly, I think somewhere, something horrible about the, our human attention when it comes to racism is, I think, fundamentally something in us doesn't care. The real difference here when we see refugees who are like us, European, and of course Russians are like us too, except that we have another layer of racism there, which is anti-Russian phobia or Russophobia, which is a type of racism that has been, deeply encoded in Western media since perhaps as early as 1917, perhaps earlier, but certainly that was intensified throughout what we know as the Cold War.
Well, the heroic efforts within Russia of people rising up and protesting on the streets. maybe more of the rhetoric is anti-Putin than anti-Russia.
Doing his part is Yevgeny from Moscow. He decided to leave Russia after being detained at an anti-war protest.
I don't want to fight in this war against Ukrainians.
Certainly the surface is, but then again, world leaders in conflicts are always monsterized, and world leaders tend to be the symbol of the nation. So when we monsterize Putin, I don't think it's really fair to describe him as unhinged or as crazy. He's the president of his country. His interest is his own national interest. And this is all set against the backdrop of, you know, a betrayal by the West, stemming back all the way to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany, and promises made to the Soviet Union that NATO would not expand eastward. And of course, began to expand eastward, and this strangulation process began. It would be natural in any geopolitical context for Russia to look after its own interests. And it's come to a climax at Ukraine. And the real trouble here now is that this Russophobia has been directed then towards Putin. And we see it in the commentary happening in many of the newspapers. We see it in the commentary happening online. You know, this dismissive treatment of Russian soldiers. There's a sense of glee in the destruction of columns of armored tanks. And we have to remember that these are the sons of mothers and fathers too. These are young men. These are, you know, as young as 18 years old. And yet when we see these soldiers close up, we find out that many of them don't wish to be there. Many of them have been humanized by the Ukrainians themselves, who've taken them as prisoner and have given them phone calls home to their families. And we get to see human beings who are in a conflict as soldiers and would do as British soldiers do in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq. In fact, you know, when it comes to blaming countries for warfare, we're not exactly the best at being peaceful.
The solution is, though, when, you know, we have white journalists standing there saying these people are from Europe, it's a civilized place, as though the inference is that Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, Yemen, and all the other trouble spots around the world aren't civilized and involve people with black skins or olive skins or people of color. Do you think the journalists realize that they are being subliminally racist?
Well, no. This is how racism operates. We live, I wrote only the other day in an article I published in my own blog that we live within a deeply racist society. And yet, no doubt many people would read that, you know, and say, but I'm not a racist. There's not a racist bone in my body. And I think that's what people like to think is true. And yet the reality is racism happens at a much more deep psychological level, at a cultural level.
Well,
and certainly within hegemonic national society. Yeah.
We had one TV journalist saying, you know, these people are just like us. These people are in Europe. And he then said, I'm having to choose my words carefully. And I'm thinking, well, no, you're not choosing your words carefully.
Well, of course. And that kind of language gives away certain assumptions you get to see from these journalists. When I describe people like me, I'm also describing the huge...
Sorry, I've got a very vocal little dog here.
One quarter of the world's refugees right now in sub-Saharan Africa, and we don't know anything about it. Well, of course, and that kind of language gives away certain assumptions you get to see from these journalists. When I describe people like me, I'm also describing the huge...
Sorry, I've got a very vocal little dog here.
One quarter of the world's refugees right now about it, but these are human beings just like us. And it was interesting that in this context, one of the great things that frustrated me most was incidences that began to happen in the first few days of the conflict on the Polish border, where buses were transporting refugees, people fleeing, trying to get into Poland from Lviv. And the police in Ukraine, the army in Ukraine, and even Ukrainian refugees were beginning to shout in frustration, why are you letting the blacks on the bus? And this was reported by numerous reporters. It was reported by what's his name, the UN High Commissioner, I have his name somewhere, Filippo Grandi, had tweeted about this. It ended up in the New York Post, the Washington Post, sorry, that even the racism of refugees against other people. But when we think about certainly as the United Nations Charter on the Refugees 1951 talks about who the refugee is, it's without distinction of place of origin or religion or race.
I mean, if we can just put the refugees to one side at the moment, there's also the style of reporting that we've seen in Ukraine is quite different. There has been international outrage and huge headlines in recent days over the bombing of schools and hospitals. And yet this has routinely happened under Western forces in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Palestine.
Well, even more interestingly, if we want to assume the racist garb of our Western European quote-unquote white society, then one of the best examples of the hypocrisy there happened in 1995 with the bombing of Belgrade by NATO forces, schools and hospitals. There was, as the United States described it and gave us this new terminology of collateral damage. These were white people just like us, if we want to use those terms. Yeah, there is definitely the treatment of, and I think this is more political than just racist. It's wanting to focus on certain images that are visceral. And again, we see this in the treatment of refugees who are black or people of color. You know, the assumption is that we expect this from Somalia. This is a savage society. You know, this is the white man's burden. This is the way we're taught to behave, and we've inherited a great deal of this. And I think this is a nightmare we have to overcome. But yesterday there was an image of a pregnant woman being removed on a stretcher, and she was white and pregnant, and the visceral reaction reached a pitch I think only dogs could hear. Screaming in the Western media of how barbaric. I think that was one headline, barbaric. Mm-hmm. Well, how more barbaric is that than, you know, rape being used as a weapon in the Central African Republic, you know, or the use of child soldiers, you know, and we have to remember that these conflicts in majority black African countries are happening in post-colonial context, screaming in the Western media of how barbaric. I think that was one headline, barbaric. Belgium, Britain, France created these nightmares and have perpetuated them through, let's face it, just an incredibly racist global economic system that prefers the global north, which is majority white.
And that just about wraps up our show for this week. Please send us your views. Let us know what you think about In Conversation with me, Yvonne Ridley. Thank you and goodbye.